Welcome to tonight's Wu University presentation, utilizing topography guided custom Ortho-k designs with Dr. Aneth Pillay. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Stewart, tonight. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pillay. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin and his Doctor of Optometry from the University of Houston College of Optometry. He's the co-owner of Evolutionary Eyecare, where he has a clinical emphasis on anterior segment disease, including keratoconus, specialty contact lenses, Ortho-k, myopia management, and ocular surface disease. He's written articles and lectured on the topics of scleral lenses, ocular surface disease, Ortho-k, and practice management. He's a fellow of the International Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia-control and of the Scleral Lens Education Society. He's a clinical adjunct professor at the University of Houston College of Optometry, an active member of the AOA and the Texas Optometric Association, and is on the board of the Harris County Optometric Society. He's also served as past president. He serves on the board for the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia-control and the advisory board of Young OD Connect, and is the Texas leader of the Young ODs of America. Welcome to Wu University. His financial disclosures have all been mitigated, and now I will turn the presentation over to you.
Man, can I make myself feel important? What an introduction. Thank you so much. That was great. All right. I am so looking forward to this. Thank you guys for having me. This is a topic that's so personal to me, so near and dear to my heart, Ortho-k, and especially these customized Ortho-k designs. So I hope you have fun with me while I'm presenting. And let's get rolling. So we're talking specifically about custom Ortho-k today. So there's a lot of Ortho-k designs out there, but the ones that we're specifically talking about are topography based, and it's where the practitioner is fully in control. So customization is so important. And the studies show if you have a custom product, consumers are willing to pay more. So I always love to talk to my patients and saying, hey, this is an actual custom design. This fits you or your child and nobody else. So I think that's another added benefit of saying that the perceived benefit that you can relate to your patients and to their children. So I always love having that custom option. So with these custom designs that are for you, some of the advantages: don't need a diagnostic set. You're not pulling out a set from years ago, putting a lens on the eye and trying to manipulate it. It's all software integration. So there's no need to put in a corneal mold on a patient's eye, evaluate it, take measurements, and then design off of that. That can sometimes be a little bit of a tricky situation, especially with young kids, of putting a design on the eye. Now, there are some advantages, so you can get the initial reaction, but it just goes so much smoother where if you can just get the initial data and then design it and then have an exciting, just really joyous occasion when the patient comes in later on, when the molds come in, and you can say, hey, we're ready. This is when we start the process. And the initial evaluation isn't a big hand-holding session. So with the software integration, what happens is you actually take topography, you take HVID, you take manifest refraction, cyclorefraction, if indicated for children, and you actually import it into the software design that's going to make this corneal retainer for you. So how do you get started? Well, before you get too custom, you got to know the basics. And one resource I would highly recommend is AOMC. This is an organization that has a lot of great content on Ortho-k and myopia control. They have webinars. They have a conference that's coming up soon. So if you're looking to really get into myopia control, I think this is the best resource to start, whether it's how to do Ortho-k, other myopia control modalities, or even practice management. So I highly recommend looking up AOMC and learning more about this organization. So I don't want to jump into the custom stuff yet, because you got to have a foundation, right? Before you get into the more advanced stuff, you got to have a solid foundation of how Ortho-k works. So we'll go through this, I say fairly briefly. Hopefully I won't be too long-winded. All right. So the mechanism of action of Ortho-k is, well, it's positive centrally and negative in the mid-peripherally. So what we're doing is we're putting a corneal RGP, all right, in a reverse geometry design to create this positive positive push force centrally and a negative pull force in the mid-peripherally. And what that's accomplishing is distributing the tear film layer to kind of move some of that cells out into the mid-periphery to get visual correction centrally, create a steepening in the mid-periphery to create that peripheral myopic defocus by that peripheral plus. So that's how Ortho-k works. So if you look at the top portion, this positive push force, and what you want to recognize is we're not actually mushing the cornea. All right, there is still some clearance here, but you're creating this gradient. So you have this very flat area of the design centrally, and then you really ramp up in the mid-periphery. So what that causes is migration of cells to ramp up in the mid-periphery to cause that peripheral myopic defocus, but still cause that central flattening where you're getting that vision correction. And that's the basic mechanism of action. I can go into much more detail on this, but that's kind of how it all works. So let's go into how a Ortho-k design works. And what I'm talking about here is kind of our traditional designs that you're used to probably hearing. You know, when you have these different curvatures and what they're doing, when do you modify them? Let's get into the architecture of how Ortho-k works. So the first thing is the base curve, which is central. All right, you move out into this rapid area of much more fluorescein pooling. That's the reverse curve. You can see this on the fluorescein pattern as well. Then you get this area of black right here. That's the alignment curve. And then this periphery where you have the peripheral curve to get some tear exchange. So each design basically reacts on this fundamental design. All right, almost all Ortho-k designs work on this philosophy. Now, you can have some designs that work a little bit different. You might have one or two reverse curves. You might have one or two alignment curves, etc. But the basic philosophy is this. You want to have a base curve, reverse curve, alignment curve, and then peripheral curve. That's how almost all Ortho-k designs work, right? So let's go through these one by one. The first thing is the base curve. So that's the central area. This is a fluorescein pattern at the slit lamp. You can see this area that looks like almost bearing. And then on the corresponding topographical image, you see this area flattening centrally. So this is what the base curve really interacts with the cornea. You see this area on the retainer as fluorescein and then the topographical corresponding image. All right. So what is the base curve for? Well, this is a little bit confusing if you do a lot of corneal or RGP designs. Let's say it's for high ametropia or high astigmatism, keratoconus, ectasia, etc. You're so used to changing base curve for the fitting relationship. What's different with Ortho-k, the base curve has nothing to do with the fitting relationship. It's all about refractive error correction. So it is the central zone, but think about base curve purely on a treatment effect, meaning how much refractive error am I correcting? That's where the base curve is important. So if you look at this image, it shows a tear layer profile corresponding underneath with a fluorescein image of how the Ortho-k retainer would look at a slit lamp image. So you see centrally this area of black that looks like bearing. And I say it looks like bearing because we're not actually compressing the cornea at all. We have a little bit of lift. You just can't visualize it because of the molecular weight of fluorescein. So the molecular weight of fluorescein is about 20 to 25 microns. So if you have anything less than that, you won't be able to visualize it. So we aim for about 5 microns, 10 microns, 20 microns, maybe in an Ortho-k design. So you're not going to appreciate that at the slit lamp. So it'll look like bearing, but it's not true bearing. And we'll talk about kind of the consequences if you actually bear it on the cornea later on. So centrally, you'll see this thin layer of clearance of the quote unquote base curve. And at the slit lamp, you'll see this area of bearing, quote unquote bearing. And the whole purpose of the base curve, again, has nothing to do with fitting relationships. It's all about the treatment effect. It's how good can that patient see? So base curve is purely involved in treatment effect, refractive error correction. It has nothing to do with the fitting relationship. And just like I said, you're only going to modify the base curve if you're under or over correcting. If you're decentering, if you have any fitting relationship issues, this is not your curve. All right. The curve to modify for refractive error is base curve. Fitting relationship, this is not your curve. We'll get into the curve to modify for that. Next curve is the reverse curve. And you can see on the fluorescein pattern is where you get to see the steepening of a lot of fluorescein coming on underneath the retainer. And on the topographical image, you'll see the steepening in this red image, this really nice concentric, basically peripheral plus. And there are two things that the reverse curve does, and it's really where all the magic happens. We'll get into that in just a second. But I want to point out on the tear film layer, all right, we got past the base curve. We see this area of what looks like bearing, right? Which we know it's not, because you still have a little bit of tear film, right? And then you have this really ramping up of steepening into the reverse curve. This is where you get all the way up and you have this nice band of fluorescein. And what the reverse curve does is two things, like I mentioned. It controls the sagittal height of the Ortho-k design. I want you to remember sagittal height. We'll get into this as we really dive into the custom Ortho-k designs. A lot of Ortho-k retainers really focus on either curvatures or diopters of power, but when you're designing off of topography and a software base, it's going to be a little bit more tear film analysis. So clearance, sagittal depth, those things become more important. So where the reverse curve really is impactful in Ortho-k is lifting and lowering the sagittal height of the entire design of the corneal retainer. It's also responsible for creating that peripheral plus. And if I have any attendees here that are fellow UHCO alums, we know all about how peripheral myopic defocus was really brought in play from our former dean. So, that hits home for us. But peripheral myopic defocus, that's our stop signal. That's how we're really doing myopia control, is by creating a high plus in the peripheral of the retina to make sure we're not getting that increased axial length as the child grows. So two things, it influences the design to make sure we're aligned with the cornea as we intended, but also creating that peripheral myopic defocus, which is so important for myopia control. The negative hydraulic force, what that base, it's kind of a wordy bullet point, but basically what I'm saying here is it's creating that steepening to make sure we get that central flattening. You got to get flatter in the center, steeper in the periphery to make sure you get the desired result, not only for vision correction, but also for myopia control. And when do you modify the reverse curve? Well, unlike the base curve, this is not a refractive error correction. All right, if you're having under or over correction, go to the base curve. But when you start having alignment issues, reverse curve is the first curve to start looking at. Are you having too much sagittal depth? Not enough sagittal depth? That's where you start looking at the reverse curve. Then the alignment curve. So you can see right after the reverse curve where we have this really ramping up of fluorescein pattern, we get really close to the cornea. This looks like actual bearing, maybe even more than the base curve. On the topography image, this is immediately outside of that very, you can see it. This is how abundant that red ring is. You're landing so much flatter on the cornea. So on the fluorescein pattern, you're seeing this area of black at the slit lamp, and the topography, this area of blue. So what is the alignment curve responsible for? Believe it or not, it's responsible for alignment. All right. So any issues with fitting, the alignment curve is probably where you want to start. Inferior, superior, decentration, you really want to start with the alignment curve. And what you'll notice on this tear film analysis is we go past the reverse curve. You see this area of black where you really want to align to the mid-peripheral cornea. On the tear film analysis, you'll see you're actually much more aligned in the alignment curve than you are even on the base curve. You're not mushing the cornea. You saw some clearance here, but the alignment curve, yeah, you want to get pretty close. This is super important for centration. So the alignment curve is where we're making actually fitting relationship changes, not the base curve. So you want alignment with the mid-peripheral cornea, 360 degrees around. That's what helps with centration. So when do you modify the alignment curve? Well, when you have alignment issues. Makes sense, all right? And then last but not least, but the peripheral curve. So on the fluorescein pattern, you see this nice little thick area of clearance here. This is not unlike a corneal RGP. You want to make sure you have a nice area of clearance because you want some tear exchange there. It's very hard to see it on the topography. But what is the peripheral clearance actually going to look like under tear film analysis? Well, we can see it's a big ramping up. It's almost at the reverse curve. Depending on the design, each of those will be different. You may have almost matching the peak of the reverse curve. Some might be a little bit less. But the point is, you're going to have up, down, and then an up again. And this is important not only for centration and treatment effect, but also for corneal health. So when you have a very low edge lift, meaning it's coming down so quickly on the peripheral cornea, it's going to cause some corneal compromise. So you really want to take a look at what that cornea looks like without a retainer on the eye. And if you're starting to see keratitis, one thing you want to think is, well, what does that retainer look on the eye? Do I have a low band of peripheral clearance? Is it half of this amount? I may be inducing some of that keratitis because that peripheral design is just landing too soon, too tight. So it may cause some of that keratitis you're thinking about. So you want a nice band of tear exchange. The other thing is you don't want too much of that edge lift either, because that will cause patient discomfort. When any type of design lifts up too much, the patient's going to complain. So you want to look out for patient complaints of discomfort. And then number two, are you having any corneal compromise? All right. That was a quick and simple. That's the fundamentals. That's what you need to know to get started. Now that you know how Ortho-k works, you know how the architecture works, what each different curve does and when to modify. What's the next step? Now we're getting into the custom Ortho-k designs, where you are completely in the driver's seat. These designs are completely in your hands. There's no lab consultant. I take that back. Some of them have them, but in the most part, you are in charge of every decision. There's no prearranged algorithm. You make every parameter change. So you have complete control of the design. That sounds awesome, but it can be super intimidating. And I get it. I remember when I was first approached with some of these designs, I was like, this is going to take me forever, not only to design, but to learn. I mean, I'm making these Ortho-k designs and calling up the lab and telling my parameters and, you know, bingo, bango, and I'll see the next patient, right? 5-10 minutes. So there's this huge learning curve and it's expensive for your time. It's expensive because you're paying for all the different retainers you're ordering. It's not a limited remakes like some labs offer. So there's a lot that goes into it and it can be very intimidating to start. And why would you ever go into it? And the reason is once you get the understanding of how these designs work, it'll be so worth it. Your understanding of how Ortho-k works skyrockets, where you're not relying on consultants. You are the consultant. You're handling tougher cases. You're not limited by -4s and a diopter of SIL. You know what to look for to get into these high designs, -5s, -7s, -10s, -12s, -20s, 2-3 diopters of SIL. And you'll know how to realize which case is a good case and which is not, because when you design it yourself, you see the process through. And then when you get good at it, then your chair time goes down. Then you're seeing patients less. You're doing less remakes. And then your colleagues realize you are the expert. So there's no doubt it takes time. But anything that's worthwhile takes the effort and the time to get good at. And I promise you, if you invest your time into this, I think you'll be rewarded on the back end of not only the patient satisfaction, but your understanding of Ortho-k and myopiacontrol work. And then the results, they speak for themselves. This is a very high myop, a very high SIL patient that wouldn't be accepted by other designs. But when you design, you decide what you accept. So the first step, great topography. That is the biggest thing. These designs are software-based, so they require your topography to upload. If you have poor data coming in, you're going to have poor data coming out. So I cannot emphasize enough how important great topography is. Even with other Ortho-k designs, topography is so important. But with these custom software designs, oh my gosh, it's above and beyond. You have to get great topography images. It is the source of how the software makes an initial design, and it's the basis of how you're going to make modifications. So any artifacts, tear film issues, if you have a placido-based topographer, or if you have a something like a pentacam that is taking non-tear film based, but lid artifacts, you have to get the best baseline you can. You only get one baseline. You got to make it great. And this is an image of a great topography. And I would challenge everybody, if you're going forward with Ortho-k, especially with a custom Ortho-k design, you got to get an image like this. All right. Let's show the example. On the left, that's the poor image. And on the right, that's a great image. Which one do you think will have a better design? Obviously the right. Now, I can see how somebody could argue to me that, hey, the left one's not so bad. Like, I know it's not as good as the right, but, we got a lot of data. Like, let's live in the real world. Nith, you're telling me that's not good enough to do an Ortho-k design? I do that all the time. I'm telling you no. This is not good enough. And I have this in my practice all the time. I work in a private practice. I get it. I have my staff take 10 to 12 images. I have them do it over and over until we get it. And if I don't get that image on the right, then maybe Ortho-k isn't the option. I need good data, because if I start with poor data, I'm in a long voyage of trying to figure out what's going on. So start with great data. It's so worth the time. All right. So once you get the great topography, which I already emphasized is so important, the way these custom designs work is you actually upload the maps into a software platform. There's a few companies that do it. And these are all based on tier layer profile. They don't work with millimeters of curvature, diopters of curvature. They're all based on how does the back surface of the Ortho-k retainer interact with the back surface of the cornea, the front surface of the cornea, and what does that tier layer relationship looks like? And I'm going to show you some examples here. So here's one custom software design. This top image is showing what the actual retainer looks like. This is not a cartoon. It is actually showing center thickness versus edge thickness. This is an actual live design. So if I change any parameter, that top image will change. On the bottom image, it is showing what the back surface of the retainer looks like in comparison to the front surface of the cornea. So, and I'm not sure, maybe somebody can, Dr. Stewart, maybe you can tell me, can you guys see my mouse move at all?
Yes, I can see it.
Wonderful. Okay. So what you're seeing here, this is the front surface of the Ortho-k retainer, and this x-axis is the back surface of the cornea. So you're seeing how much tear film you're having from the cornea to the Ortho-k design. And as you expect, much higher in the reverse curves, the reverse zones, I'll call it, much lower at the apex of the cornea, and then you have a little bit of lift at the edge. So these all will change as you make modifications, okay? So what happens here is you put in a refraction, put an HVID, upload the topography, it spits out what it thinks would be the best fitting design based on its own algorithm. And each company is going to be a little bit different. So here's another design example, a little bit different, where you have the actual tear film analysis on top and then a fluorescein pattern on the bottom. So again, you're going to be typing in a refraction, HVID. You can have the software just import it from your topographer if you like, or manually measure it. I actually would recommend probably manually measuring it off of a either a slit lamp, or if you have a shine fluke image system, maybe measuring off of that. But once you put that data in, it's going to spit something out, and you'll have this initial tear film analysis. And then you start to really work. And then here's another example of a third company that does a lot of custom software-based Ortho-k designs. Again, they're all tear film based. You see that. You see where it's all based on the depth of the retainer. It's not reporting, or you're not even really looking at what is the base curve, what is the curvature of the reverse curve, the curvature of the alignment curve. No, you're worried about microns. And that's what's important when you get into these custom designs. So once you decide on whichever company you want to work with, what will happen is you'll actually import that into your topography software. So you have a little button that says, boom, import topography, create a design. And you'll enter in the target correction, you'll upload the actual topography, and then a tier level profile will actually come up. Now, once that comes up, that doesn't mean it's what you're ordering. It's just a baseline to start. That's when you get to work. Once the design is uploaded into the software, then you're going meridian by meridian to say what kind of changes you make. So let's look at one example. This is a particular software design where you'll select that you want an Ortho-k design. The topography is already uploaded. You'll put in the HVID and then a spectacle refraction. And then once you put that in, it'll populate an initial tier film analysis of a design that it just created based on an algorithm. Now, you might look at this and say, well, you know, it looks good, but maybe it's needs some modification. So it's very rare that you'll just have it populate a design and you're not making any changes. You want to evaluate everything. You'll have to look at, all right, what's the apical clearance look like? Is that reverse zone looking where I want it to be? How is the periphery landing? And now you're going to make these changes. So one thing you'll see here is based on this tier film analysis and the amount of microns of apical clearance, this may look like, oh, well, maybe I'm having too much apical clearance. Maybe I need to land a little bit closer to the cornea. And you really have to talk to each manufacturer because each design will be different. Some will aim for maybe 10 to 20 microns of apical clearance. Some will aim for 0. It doesn't mean that that's what's actually going to happen when you evaluate the patient. It's just how the software interprets your topography. So you got to remember, even with software-based designs, you know, everybody lies. If there are any Dr. House fans in here, right? When you import a topography, the software has to interpret that. Then it spits out a pattern. That pattern will be a little bit manipulated. So you got to realize not everything's going to be exactly the same. So leaning on those companies to say, hey, what is the recommendation goes a long way because you got to, they'll know their algorithms better than we do. So with this particular design, I was like, you know, that might be a little bit too much. So what kind of changes can I make? Well, that's the initial design. And then maybe I want to reduce the sagittal depth. And remember, I said sagittal depth. That's important to remember as we go along. I'm not talking about curves. Everything is about tier film analysis and sagittal depth, okay? So I thought that was too high, the 28 microns, and I wanted to reduce the sagittal depth of the return zone. That is the equivalent of other designs saying, hey, I want to flatten the reverse curve. But in these custom designs, we're talking sagittal depth in every different zone, all right? So all I did here was actually reduce the sagittal depth at that reverse zone. And we see much closer landing to the cornea, much more of a design that I think will be successful in Ortho-k. Now, we'll go through some other examples. I won't necessarily want to make these changes, but I just wanted to show what would happen if I make design changes that aren't typical, what would happen to that tier film analysis. So we flatten the alignment curve. This actually isn't too bad. You flatten the alignment curve, you get a little closer to the cornea, but it's not as big of a change as we saw at that return zone. We saw about 6 microns centrally here, but if I just do the same change in the alignment zone, it's close, not quite, but it's going in the right direction. So from the initial design here, all I changed with that alignment zone, reducing the sagittal depth, and we get a little bit closer to the cornea, a little bit closer in that mid-periphery here as well. Here's the initial design again. And what I'm going to do here is do a no-no, right? I'm going to increase the sagittal depth. We definitely don't want to do that, but I want you to show how the software shows you and depicts what that looks like. So now what I did was actually increase the sagittal depth at that reverse zone, and you see all the compounding factors. I mean, we have so much more clearance centrally. This is lifting up. I mean, we're not even landing in the mid-peripherally that great. So this is not a design we want. But I want for everyone to appreciate what happens when we make those design changes. All right. Again, here's the initial design. And this time I'll go further out. Same change, but in the alignment zone. So I'm still increasing the sagittal depth, but I'm just going further out. So we still see that increase of the apical clearance. We see some of that bleeding into the alignment zone. So again, not a proper fit. I would never make that change, but it's important to see how this software depicts those changes as you're making. Now, this is a complete software. You still have to import, or I shouldn't say import, you enter in your refraction, you put in the HVID. This will take the HVID and pupil size from your topographer if it's a company it works with, but you can manually manipulate it as well. So upload the topography, put it in your data, and it spits out an image. So this looks a little bit different. This is where you see the Ortho-k retainer on top, what it looks like. Thinness centrally, thickness centrally, what kind of clearance you see, but then the tier profile on the bottom. And this is where you start making the manipulations in the design. So I'm going to walk through the same thing, but with this different platform. So this is the initial design, just like I showed you. All right. And let's say I just want to make the same design changes I did on the previous company. I want to steepen the reverse zone, steepen the alignment zone, flatten the reverse zone, and flatten the alignment zone. So if we go through the first example, what we're going to do here is reduce the sagittal depth at the return zone. So you can see the clear difference. Right here, we have 0.4 apical clearance and kind of aligned in the periphery. And what I'm going to do next is actually reduce the sagittal depth at this return zone. That'll actually lift up this periphery and bring central that apical clearance down. So that will show not only the tier layer profile, but also how that retainer lands on the corneal surface. And again, here's the initial design, and I'm going to do the same thing I did before, where I'm going to reduce the sagittal depth at the alignment zone this time. So I'm going further out in the periphery. So what I'm going to do is go to this nodal point and actually reduce the sagittal depth. And you'll see not at 0.4 central clearance, we're back at 0, and you'll see a little more clearance in that periphery. What I have found over the years is the further you go out from central, the more micron change you need to make. So if we're used to saying, I want to flatten or steepen by diopters, I don't have a good relationship for microns. But what I will say is the closer you are to central, the less micron change you need to make. And the more peripheral you go, the more you need to make. So maybe 10 to 15 microns might be good, in that reverse zone area. You go out more in the periphery, you might need 20 to 30 microns. That's a good rule of thumb. Sometimes I need to go more than that, but that's a good rule of thumb. 10 to 15 kind of at that return zone, and then 20 to 30 out in that periphery to have a clinically significant effect. And oftentimes what happens is you'll have to make changes with both. And we'll actually talk about where I make a change, where it'll inadvertently make a change further out than I anticipated. And sometimes that's okay. So again, we're here in this different platform where all I did was reduce the sagittal depth at the alignment curve, quote unquote, flattening an alignment curve in a non-custom design. So here's the initial design again. And this time what we're going to do is the opposite. We're actually going to increase sagittal depth. So what I did here, again, I wouldn't do this normally, but I just want to show the depiction of it, was increase the sagittal depth at that reverse curve, which is quote unquote steepening the reverse curve. All right. So what you'll see is you'll see a lot more clearance centrally. We're at 0.4. Now we're at over 12 microns of clearance centrally. Right. Here's the initial design again. And now I'm going to go further out into the alignment zone, and I'm going to increase that sagittal depth. What you'll see, what's interesting is, yes, you still have a big impact on the central clearance. You're still going to have too much apical clearance, but you'll see that periphery just landing so steep. that it'll not have a proper relationship in the peripheral cornea. So that's the kind of give and take, is how much do you allow in the reverse zone versus how much do you allow in that mid periphery? And depending on the issue you have, especially if it's an alignment issue, you might do maybe 50% in the mid periphery and 100% in the far periphery. But if it's just a sagittal depth issue, then maybe you reverse that. So you have to kind of put those things into your design philosophy of how much impact am I making at each zone? Because remember, this is not an algorithm where you call a consultant and say, oh, it's decentering this way, what do I do? You're making the changes at every single meridian. So these are 10, 12 micron changes, but at every clock hour. So you can make this as custom as you want. Now, one cool thing about this software that I want to just point out that they really incorporated in the last, I think it was year and a half. In the past, what we'd have to do is go to these individual nodal points and change them manually. What they've done now is they've created a modification area where it'll actually do the work for you. So you can just come in and just say, hey, globally or in one quadrant or one clock hour, I want to make changes in the alignment zone, reverse, or base curve, or the optic zone diameter. And you can say, increase the sagittal depth, decrease the sagittal depth by how many microns, and in which areas you want. Do I want to do it in just half the design? Do I want to do it in a quadrant specific? And it allows you to do that. Now, one thing I will say is I believe this is in order of the most likely changes you'll make in Ortho-k. The most likely changes you'll have is alignment zone. Usually it's a centration issue. Next, reverse zone. Whether you're having keratitis, where you need to increase the sagittal depth, or you're having too much sagittal depth, or you're creating central islands, et cetera, and we'll get into that. The next most common is probably reverse zone issues. Next is the base curve. That's where you're under or overcorrecting the target correction. Most topographers are really good at central data. So it's usually not a base curve issue. That's why it's third on the list. And then last is the optic zone diameter. Now, this can change based on what your goal is. Let's say you have a 10-year-old that you've been doing myopia control for, and now they're 16 and they need to drive and they've been stable. Maybe you need to widen that optic zone diameter to reduce halos and glare, and you're not so not concerned about myopia control effect because they've been stable. Or you have an adult that you're starting from scratch and they've been stable for a while. Who cares about myopia control? That's not your goal. Your point is to give them the proper vision correction. So that's where you can make changes to the optic zone diameter. So I think in order, this is probably the most likely changes: alignment zone, then reverse zone, base curve, and optic zone diameter. I think the software platform got it right in that term. All right. And this actually shows you, as you go through each individual zone, what's happening when you make these changes, from increasing sagittal depth to decreasing sagittal depth, what's happening on that retainer. And again, you select the amount of microns and also which quadrant you want to do it, whether it's globally, half a design, or quadrant specific change. All right. So when things go wrong. So this is when you followed my advice, you imported the topography, you put in the refraction HVID, and something still happened. So I think this is what most practitioners want to see, is how to troubleshoot these cases. So when you have it in a standard Ortho-k design, you can call your lab or your consultants and say, I'm seeing this issue, and what's the recommended change, by how much, and they'll know their design and they can make a recommendation. When you're in these custom software designs, it's all you got to make those decisions. So hopefully this will give you some insights in how to make those changes and to what extent. So inferior decentration, very common. What you'll see here is the topographer with this white ring is depicting the pupil. All placido-based topographers don't actually accurately represent that, but it's a good reference point. But we can all clearly see, hey, this is decentering inferiorly, okay? I mean, we have a pretty good pattern otherwise, right? We have a nice red ring of peripheral myopic defocus. We got a little bit of a lighter blue centrally. So just to go back to topography, this central area of blue is why the patient will see well. This red ring is the reason you're doing Ortho-k for myopia control. That is where you're having the redistribution of cells, the redistribution of cytoplasmic fluid. I won't get into that today, but it's where the magic happens. Like I mentioned, it's how you're getting the stop signal to the retina, but also it's where those cells centrally are going. So we have a pretty good map here. It's just going down a little bit, okay? And this lighter area is maybe a pseudo-central island, which we'll get into further. So I saw this inferior decentration, and I decided to, well, I have an alignment issue. Which curve I'm going to modify? The alignment zone, right? I'm not going to modify the base curve. That has nothing to do with a fitting issue in Ortho-k. I got to modify the alignment zone. So I went into my quick and easy tool, and I said, well, it's decentering inferiorly, so I need to decrease the sagittal depth. Okay, it's too much sagittal depth. That's why it's decentering inferiorly. I need to decrease that, and that will actually bring the design a lot more central and give a lot better visual visual outcome. So I just click decrease sag and pick the amount of microns that I want to change. So what's important here is I'm not making diopter changes or millimeter changes. I'm going by microns. Okay, I'm making tear film changes. So tear film analysis is what's important here. This was decentered inferiorly, kind of all across the board. So I'm going to make a global change. So I'm going to stay in this all mode, and I applied it. And that's the change that I got. Much better centered design, much smoother central area. The patient did so much better. They saw better, and the myopia control effect will be a lot better here as well. And what I'm depicting here is a tangential power difference map. That's what I would recommend to evaluating the shape and alignment issues. So I look through a lot of different topographies when patients come in and when I do a design. But for an Ortho-k follow-up, what I'll look at is initially a tangential power difference map. So I'll select the baseline, select the topography from that day, and look at the difference. And that's what's depicted here on this right image. So this shows me how well centered it is. It shows me what kind of impact I'm having on the myopic defocus portion of it with the peripheral myopic, the peripheral plus of this red ring. So that really shows me the shape factor issues. Now, I'll also switch to the axial difference map to show how much of a refractive error correction I got. And if your topography allows, a refractive difference map also will show that. And this is just showing the difference. This was the initial design on the left, and you can see decentering inferiorly, and all I did was really change that sagittal depth, basically reduce that sagittal depth in the alignment zone alone, and we got so much better centration, so much better outcome for this patient. Lateral decentration. This is by far the most difficult to treat. The problem here is so many things can go wrong. You could have too much sagittal depth. You could have too little sagittal depth. You could have a diameter issue. I mean, anything can go wrong in this issue. So I always say lateral decentration is so tough to deal with. You not only do you need how the topography looks, you really need to know the fluorescein image as well. That way you can evaluate how each curve looks and also if the diameter is appropriate. Maybe you under or overestimated the diameter. One thing that I will say with lateral decentration, if you're just not sure, 90% of the time in my experience, it's usually a diameter issue. And you usually went too small. So going bigger in diameter solves most of my problems. And that's where I'll start. So now if you have a diameter that's good or too big, all right, you look at the other curves. But if you're borderline, save yourself the head. I've done it so many times where I'm looking at topography and the fluorescein image, and I'm thinking, this I could look at this topography if you just want to see some insight in how I'm thinking of how to modify this, okay? So first thing I'm looking at, all right, centrally, yeah, I got a nice blue ring centrally. So they probably should see pretty well. I got a nice red ring in the peripheral. I probably got my peripheral myopic defocus good. Well, next thing I'm looking at is this blue area where the Ortho-k design should really align. I'm doing pretty good here. Whoa, what's happening on this side? I'm not landing appropriately. So I could easily convince myself without looking at a fluorescein pattern. I could say, well, what's happening is here on this side, I am too steep. I'm not landing on the cornea. I need to get closer to the cornea in the Ortho-k design to get a nice 360 blue ring. So I could have convinced myself here to saying, well, in this quadrant, I'm going to steepen the alignment zone only. Sorry, not steepen. I'm sorry. Flatten the alignment zone only to land closer to the cornea to get that 360 alignment. I could have convinced myself of that. That's what I'm thinking just looking on the topography, because that's what it looks like. But I saved myself a lot of headache by doing the fluorescein pattern and saying, hey, I was probably too small. So I started there. I like to think simple first. So what did I do? I went into the software and I said, hey, that's my overall diameter of the Ortho-k design, and I'm going to make a design change. I'm going to go bigger, and let's see what happens. If you're making a diameter change, 0.3 millimeters at least to have any clinical significance. Don't go any smaller, you're wasting your time. So go at least 0.3 millimeters on a diameter change. All right? That was the result. I made no other changes to the design. I just made the Ortho-k retainer bigger. And you can see how much better centered it is. And then look in the mid-periphery. I now have that blue ring outside without having it to flatten any type of alignment zone in any quadrant. So from going from here to there with the diameter change, just trust me, a lateral decentration start with overall diameter. That is 90% of the time we're having issues. And what's tricky here, this patient wasn't really complaining. They were a high myope with some astigmatism. So on refraction, they had some residual astigmatism, which I clearly induced with this. They were plano in their myopia, but they biopsied SIL and young kid, they were fine. They could still see good. They're not going to complain about this, but I know we could do better than this. Okay. And without making any quadrant specific changes, without having to do anything super, minuscule, one little area, I made a global change of making the entire retainer bigger, and look how much better that result is. So you'll be surprised of how global changes can solve even quadrant specific problems. So lateral decentration by far the most difficult to deal with, but start with diameter changes. All right, central island. So this is an interesting case. I actually mentioned earlier, while we're getting on early to prep for this meeting, I had an issue where my initial presentation wasn't available to me, where I had my laptop, and unfortunately my puppy just decided to chew my charger, and my laptop is not working anymore. So you guys got new cases today. This was all put in just today, so nobody else has seen this. You are the first. So what you're seeing here is inferior decentration, which I think we can all agree, right? If this is depicting broadly what the pupil will be, you see it's decentering inferiorly. And what you'll commonly see in inferior decentration is a central island will form. The reason you have inferior decentration in most cases is because you have too much sagittal depth. Too much sagittal depth in an Ortho-k design will cause inferior decentration, but it will also cause central islands. So it is not uncommon to see both of those things happen together. This is not a traditional central island. It looked a little funky, but I can see, well, I got this nice blue ring, but then I got this blip, right? It's not as flattened as the other areas, top and bottom. So it's not the smooth treatment zone that I'd like to see. That's weird. It could be, well, did I, create a astigmatic treatment zone inadvertently. I don't know yet, but it was decentered inferiorly. And I chalked it up to, I probably created a weird central island as well because of too much sagittal depth. That's what it looked like, okay? So what I decided to do is, well, if I have too much sagittal depth, I am going to actually reduce the sagittal depth. So this is what the initial design looked like. Looks very well aligned in the software. And I decided to decrease the sagittal depth of the reverse zone. I went into that software, decrease, and you don't have to do much. This was 10 microns. I made a 10 micron change at that reverse zone, and you'll see what the tear layer profile looks like. This is very subtle, and I'll show the differences here in just a second. So if you look here, and what I'm looking at is this blue area of about, I'm about 598 microns. This is showing the difference from basically the retainer to the cornea. That's basically what's measured. It's called lens sec. So 598, and I changed it, and yeah, 10 microns. I went to 588. Wasn't much. I changed the periphery a little bit as well because of the decentration issues. But after I did that, look at that result. A little better centered, much smoother treatment zone, much better outcomes. It doesn't take much to resolve some of these issues. So that's the direct comparison. This is what it looked like after the initial design. After that modification, about a 10 micron change at the reverse zone, added a couple more microns in the periphery to get a little better centered, much smoother treatment. And again, this is what the designs look like, the initial to what it looked like after make the modification. A little bit more in that mid periphery. You can even see that as I decrease the sagittal depth, I went from a micron to 0 microns here to get closer to that cornea, not only centrally, but also get a better results in the mid periphery. All right, I know I'm getting close to the end of the presentation. So one thing I just want to highlight is, I always get this question is, you know, where do I get started? Where do I learn? Well, I've started Ortho-k. I want to learn more. I cannot more highly recommend Vision by Design. It is the conference for Ortho-k, and we have it coming up this September in Chicago. Those are the dates. There's going to be so many great lectures for beginners, for experienced practitioners. I've been going every year for the last several years, and every year I end up at least at one lecture at the edge of my seat with my jaw dropped, and it changes the way I practice every single year. So I can't recommend it highly enough.